Hi, and welcome to Donald Trump's fake phony policies. This will be a series of videos outlining Donald Trump's policies and why they're fake, why they're phony, why he's misleading the American people. This chapter is economics, but stay tuned, there will be others to come. Donald Trump and his surrogates have told us for the last several months that he will produce 4% GDP growth over the next 5 years. Here he is telling the Economics Club of New York that very same story.
We're thinking big once again. That's why I believe it's time to establish a national goal of reaching 4% economic growth. And my great economists don't want me to say this, but I think we can do better than that.
Really, Donald? 4% growth over 5 years. By the way, his great economist friends are Larry Kudlow and David Malpass. More about them later. This is a chart of real gross domestic product for the last 70 years, from 1947 on till about July or so of this current year. It's obtained directly from the Federal Reserve Economic Database of the St. Louis Federal Reserve Bank. This chart, horizontal line along the chart in red, is 4% average GDP growth. 4%. Each of these vertical lines shows a 5-year interval from 1950 to 55, 60, 65, etc. You'll notice that in 70 years, there has not been a single instance in which there has been 4% GDP growth over 5 consecutive years. Not one. Not one. But let's give Donald Trump the benefit of the doubt. He and his surrogates tend to be imprecise in their language, so instead of presuming a 4% GDP growth over 5 consecutive years, let's assume that he was talking about a 4% average GDP growth over 5 consecutive years. That's what the numbers shown on this scatter plot are. This goes from 1951 to 2015. 1951 includes 1947, 1948, 1949, 1950, and 1951. So 1970, you'll see the number is 2.9%. Now that 2.9% is not 1970's GDP, it is the average of the GDP for each of the 5 years, including 1970 and prior. So it goes from 1970 to 1969, 1968, 1967, and 1966. We took the GDP for each of those 5 years, totaled them, and then took an average of the 5 years and came up with 2.9%. As you can see here, where this red line is drawn at 4%, which is Donald Trump's threshold, we were doing fairly well in producing 5-year average growth of GDP of 4% or better prior to 1970. But prior to 1970, we weren't really an integrated global economy. In 1970 also, Japan, Germany, even England to a certain extent, were still rebuilding their infrastructure from the demolition it received in World War II. we were still largely the world's factory. I can remember as a child buying, quote, cheap Japanese junk toys at the local five and dime. You'd pick up a toy automobile, and if you looked underneath the painted surfaces, you'd see a Folgers or a Maxwell House coffee can label on the inside of the car. That's what Japan was producing prior to 1970. 1970, though, in the early 70s, we started having the oil shocks. Americans started buying imported Toyota cars, imported German cars, a lot more Volkswagens, what have you. So our GDP fell off precipitously in those years, the prior year average GDPs. The economy has changed notably. Since 1985, you'll notice, which is 30 years ago, we have had only 6 instances where we have produced greater than 4% GDP. And in 4 of those 6 instances, we have just barely made it over the threshold. In 1986, 87, and 88, we benefited from Ronald Reagan's military buildup and also from the launch of Microsoft, Apple. This is when these companies started having wider play within the business economy, at least. They weren't so much in the home computer market at that point, but in the business market they were making great inroads. 1998, 99, and 2000, that was the period of the tech boom or tech bubble, depending on how you look at it, and not really representative of the wider economy. So we had some one-shots here during these years. We had the Reagan military buildup and the launch of the first tech companies. And over here we had the tech boom, tech bubble. But prior to that, for 30 odd years, 35 years really, we weren't really doing greater than 4% growth. Of late, Donald and his surrogates have dropped the 4% growth meme and are talking more and more about a 3.5% GDP growth over 5 years. This is the same scatter point chart that we saw in the earlier slide, except this one has the line drawn at 3.5%. You'll see that in 1996 we had exactly 3.5% prior year, five prior year GDP growth. Even at 3.5%, we've only exceeded that threshold 2 more times. Once in 1996, once in 1989. In the last 30 years, 35 years. Go back to 1980. Very few instances where we've exceeded 3.5% average cumulative 5-year GDP in excess of 3.5%. I said I'd come back to these guys. David Malpass and Larry Kudlow. Let's talk about Kudlow first. Kudlow is well known as a CNBC commentator, economic commentator, and host, and he also hosts a radio program, I believe, in WABC in New York City. In February 27th, 2008, in the National Review, Kudlow wrote that tariffs and trade barriers are bad news. Scapegoating free trade make catchy headlines for pandering populist policymakers, But let's be clear, NAFTA is not responsible for the loss of manufacturing jobs, not by a long shot. Now that's coming from one of Donald Trump's economic policymakers, economic advisors. And when he refers to pandering populist policymakers, he could just as easily be referencing a pandering populist orange-colored politician by the name of Donald Trump. Now let's talk about David Malpass. In August 7, 2007, David Malpass was the chief economist of Bear Stearns. He wrote an article in the Wall Street Journal with the headline, "Don't Panic About the Credit Market." But just over 9 months later, on March 16, 2008, Malpass' firm, Bear Stearns, was in veritable collapse from the credit crunch that he had told us not to panic about. It was sold off to J.P. Morgan in a sale orchestrated by the Federal Reserve for pennies on the dollar of what it had been worth when Malpass' article appeared. So those are the two economists that are advising Donald Trump on economic matters. Not the best choices, in my view. Anyway, look for our next video, which will discuss the absurdity of Donald Trump's wall with the border of Mexico. And if you have comments in the meantime, you feel free to contact us at trumpsphony@gmail.com. Thanks a lot. Bye.